Hello, everyone. Dr. Christine Smith here. I am so excited to talk to you today with my friend Kate Vazquez. She is the author of Estrogen is a Bitch, which I love the title. I think she did such a great job. And so I'm just going to go ahead and add her in here. Let's see. There she is. All right, so she should be on in just a minute. So we're going to be talking a little bit about estrogen dominance and hormones and how to optimize your cycle and all those things. Hi, Kate. How are you this morning?
Hi, Christine. I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to talk about this stuff and hear everything that you have to say. And I was already showing everybody your amazing book, so I would love to just talk a little bit about that and all of that kind of stuff. So I know one of the things that the book is about is kind of estrogen dominance and how to optimize your hormones and things like that. So I'd love if you could just kind of tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so excited that we're having this conversation today because well, to give a little background, I experienced it firsthand. I had gone through functional medicine to heal my body because I had a lot of gut issues, migraines, acne, anxiety, and was on birth control at the time. But I worked on healing my gut, learned how to manage the anxiety because no one ever taught us how to do that. Instead you go to the doctor and they just want to prescribe a pill, which I was on Prozac at one point in my life, but I realized it wasn't helping the anxiety because it was all within. Like, how did I respond to the situation that I was in? So I learned how to manage that through yoga, meditation, deep breathing. And once I healed my body, I finally was ready to come off birth control because I read Jolene Brighten's Beyond the Pill to help prepare my body to come off birth control so I wouldn't have anything crazy happen. But unfortunately, it did. My hormones went crazy and I was shocked. I was surprised. I was like, what's going on with my body? Because I worked on healing my gut. I managed the stress. I was taking a bunch of supplements to support my nutrients. But I hadn't tested my hormones because I was on the pill. Everything's always suppressed when you're on the pill. So I ended up doing testing for my hormones and discovered I had an imbalance with estrogen and progesterone. My progesterone levels were really, really low, and I needed to support metabolism of estrogen in my body because it was building up and contributing to a lot of the symptoms I was experiencing for the first time in my life, which was irregular cycles, menstrual cramps, breast tenderness. I even started gaining a little bit of weight in my butt, hips, and thighs, which was not normal for me because I've always just been very active and lean and
And nowadays they're basically like, oh yeah, that's just your cycle. That's totally normal. Don't worry about it.
Exactly. And it's like, no, we unfortunately, women were taught, and even in PA school too, when I was going through school, it was just like, yeah, PMS symptoms, they're normal. Treat it with anti-inflammatory like Advil and Midol. But the problem is that those things affect our gut. They disrupt our microbiome. And if you have like not PMS, but PMDD, so anxiety, depression, with that too, put them on anti-anxiety or antidepressant medications. But it doesn't really treat the root of why it's happening in the first place. And what I discovered when I tested my hormones and learned how to balance my hormones naturally, all those symptoms went away. I went back to having regular cycles again, minimal to no cramps every cycle. I was able to lose the weight, get back to my healthy, optimal weight that I was. And I realized I started seeing the same pattern in a lot of my female clients as well, and helping them to get rid of the PMS issue so that they actually can live life and enjoy life. They're not struggling and suffering every month, from debilitating PMS symptoms. And when I was thinking about estrogen dominance, because what estrogen dominance is basically an imbalance of estrogen in ratio to progesterone. And I discovered there were 3 different types, which is what I discuss in the book. But when I was thinking about estrogen dominance and how it impacts women and contributes to all the crazy symptoms, I was like, wow, estrogen is a bitch.
I I love the title of your book, and everyone that I've shared it with, they're like, "Oh my gosh, that's great!" And I think it's so on point. And I know that you are like a very you're probably one of the just like kindest, gentlest souls I've met. And so the title is just like not your norm. And I think it sticks out so well. So
Yeah.
I'd love to just kind of help people understand a little bit more about what some of these symptoms can look like. And before we dive into that, one of the things I love to educate people on is like some of the pathways that happen so that they can really understand. And that's one of the reasons I love her book. So if you guys want to understand more the mechanisms behind this, she dives into the metabolites and all that stuff. But then back to her comment about taking like Advil and anti-inflammatories for all of this stuff. The way that that kind of works, and one of the ways that it can kind of disrupt your body, is it stops inflammation by stopping the production of something called prostaglandins. And prostaglandins are involved in the inflammatory process, and when you stop those things, it can really help. But one of the other things that they don't really tell you, which was her comment about how it affects your gut, is prostaglandins are also necessary to build the mucosal linings of your body, which is why you can get stomach ulcers and gut issues and a whole bunch of other stuff as weird side effects that they never tell you about with those things. So that's why I'm such an advocate for always kind of working on these things naturally. So yeah, I'd love to just kind of dive into some of the symptoms that people might experience that they've been told is totally normal. And they're like, oh yeah, like I've always struggled with acne or whatever. And just to kind of help women know that, one, they're not alone, and two, it's not normal, and three, you don't have to live with it. So yeah, because you address it in the book, but I'd love if you could speak to it.
Yeah, absolutely. That is such a great question. Before I dive into all the symptoms, I do want to let women know, like, estrogen is not bad, and I don't want to give estrogen a bad rep. And yes, I'm saying it is a bitch, but it can become a bitch when it is imbalanced. And I dive into that too. Like, what are all the benefits of estrogen? Because we need it. It's very protective. It prevents a lot of chronic disorders, which is why when women go through menopause, their estrogen decline, they're actually more at risk of like heart disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's, and so much more osteoporosis, because estrogen has a protective effect. So I don't want women to fear estrogen, because estrogen is good. And I also call it the Goldilocks hormone too, because, you know, when it's balanced, when there's not too much and not too little, exactly, we have this perfect balance of estrogen. It's working optimally and helping our bodies to function at its best, and we feel our best when it does. Yeah, the problem arises when there's not enough in the system, or when it's imbalanced or too much in the system. And that's where I dive into the too much, the imbalance aspect of estrogen and what happens in our body when that happens. So as far as the symptoms, when there is imbalance or excess estrogen in the body, I created like the 5 telltale signs. Like, this is how you know you might have estrogen dominance, especially if you have 2 of the 3 symptoms. One is irregular periods. So you're not having periods the same time every month, and it's, you know, not just off by like a day or 2, but off like 7 days or more. So if it's, you know, just unpredictable, you're not sure when it's coming every month, that's definitely a sign of estrogen dominance. The next one is heavy periods. So if you're bleeding a lot, bleeding through tampons, pads, or having to empty the cup, if you're using a menstrual cup, empty that a couple times a day. Really heavy bleeding, and with or without clots too, that's definitely a huge sign, because excess estrogen, what it does is, estrogen is responsible to thicken the endometrial lining, and as the body starts to prepare for implantation. So if an egg gets fertilized, the uterus needs to be ready to receive that. And so when when pregnancy does not happen, that's when we get our period every month. But the problem is like, if we have too much estrogen in the body, it causes a really, really thick lining than normal. And that's why women will get those heavier bleeds. Also, PMS symptoms is definitely a huge symptom of estrogen dominance, which most women aren't aware of, you know, and that's because when I talk about the 3 different patterns of estrogen dominance, one pattern is normal estrogen with normal progesterone with high levels of estrogen. And then you have 2 other patterns, which is low progesterone with either normal or high estrogen. So it's with those 2 patterns, when progesterone drops and is a little bit lower than it should be, it can create the mood swings, the anxiety, the depression. It can contribute to headaches. It can cause insomnia, keep us from sleeping well at night, because progesterone is our feel-good hormone, and we sleep like a baby when they're optimal But when progesterone's lower than normal, it's going to contribute to that. And then also, you mentioned the prostaglandins, which I'm so glad you did, because that's the driving force behind those menstrual cramps. When the prostaglandins are released, that causes the uterus to contract so we can shed that endometrial layer and have our period. But when we have a lot of estrogen in the system, it can increase even more prostaglandins, creating more pain, more inflammation. And so that's why a lot of women will experience those severe cramps. And then the fourth symptom is breast tenderness, which is what I was experiencing, because estrogen and progesterone are responsible for the development of our breasts as we go through puberty. But if we have a lot of estrogen in our system, it's going to cause that tissue to swell and become very painful, especially that week right before our period. And also some women, if they have a lot of estrogen, tend to get fibrocystic breast disease, or they'll get some nodules in the breast because this excess estrogen is causing those cysts and nodules to develop. So if someone has, very dense breast, fibrocystic breasts, definitely want to get their estrogens checked because there might be some imbalance there. And then the last symptom is weight gain, and that's exactly what I experienced too. But not just weight gain anywhere, it's especially in the butt, hips, and thighs. And this is because as we go through puberty, women get curves in their butt, hips, and thighs, and that's due to estrogen. Like, estrogen's supposed to give us our curves. The problem is when we start gaining a lot of weight and it dumps right there in the butt, hips, and thighs, that's definitely a huge sign of estrogen dominance. So it's funny because I was speaking with someone else, and I'm like, it's almost like, the songs we hear about, like, Becky, look at her butt, or I like big butts and I cannot line. I'm like, that's talking about estrogen dominance. So yeah. I mean, it's kind of funny when you think about it, but yeah, that's a sign of estrogen dominance. And, and it's like when we look at and talk about weight, it's like really unhealthy weight gain, and it's occurring in the butt, hips, and thighs. So those are the 5 telltale signs. If you have 2 or more of those symptoms, there's definitely an increased chance you might have estrogen dominance. There's also so many other symptoms too that can be associated with it. In the book, there's a quiz, so I highly, highly recommend take the quiz, and then it can give you an idea, is this something that needs to get addressed right away? You need to see a practitioner to get testing for your hormones, to make sure there's no imbalance there.
Absolutely. Thank you. That was perfect. So I have like a couple things that I think would be cool to talk about. One of them, I feel like a lot of women, they have a basic understanding of how their cycle works, but no one's actually told them like what happens and like how the hormones go and like that kind of stuff. Can you just walk us through kind of like the phases and what your hormones look like and like what a healthy fluctuation looks like, just so that women can understand a little bit better?
Yeah, absolutely. I love this question because I even walk through each phase in the book as well, because you're so right. I mean, when I was younger, no one taught me about the menstrual cycle, and it wasn't until I started learning about the hormones that I was like, oh, this is what's happening in the body. And if we are aware of that, we can actually be in tune, especially when our hormones are balanced. Our energy fluctuates with our hormones, which is really cool, because another thing I talk about is how we can use our cycle as a superpower. But yeah, going back to the phases, there's 4 different phases. There's the menstrual, the follicular, ovulation, and luteal phase. So the follicular and luteal phase basically break the menstrual cycle into half. There's like, if say a woman has a 28-day cycle, which it's actually not common. Most women will have like a 26-day or a 30-day cycle, as long as it's pretty regular every month. Anywhere from 24 to 32 days is normal. So however long your cycle is, it's usually broken up into the luteal or follicular and luteal phase. For a moment.
No worries.
So it breaks up the cycle into 2 phases, and then at the beginning of the follicular phase is our menstrual phase, and that our period actually is what starts the menstrual cycle, because a lot of women think the period is at the end of the cycle, and that's actually not the case. It's at the beginning. So day 1 of your period is day 1 of the menstrual cycle and starting the follicular phase, and then halfway through, as you end follicular and start the luteal phase, ovulation occurs. And so this is important to understand because, once you get ovulation, then you go into luteal phase. And so when we are starting our period with the menstrual phase, our hormones are at their lowest. And so women will typically feel their energy levels are really, really low. And then once you go through the menstrual phase, the hormones will start to increase. So we have estrogen that starts to increase, testosterone. We also have hormones such as FSH, which starts to increase first because it's preparing the egg, it's maturing it in order for it to be released at ovulation. And then right before ovulation, we get a surge, we get a peak in estrogen, testosterone, and then LH comes in to help the egg to be released at ovulation. So during the late follicular phase, as hormones are starting to increase, we actually start to feel an increase in our energy, starting to feel better, and we can like do more things. And then right before ovulation, when our hormones are at their peak, we feel like we are on top of the world. Because I know I definitely, during my ovulation, I'm like, sometimes I don't always like keep track of my cycle, but when I do, I'm like, I feel really good today. Like I'm on top of the world. And I look, I'm like, oh, of course, I'm about to ovulate. And it's so cool. Like when you're actually like in tune with your body, in tune with the energy, and your hormones are balanced, you can use it to work in your favor. So once ovulation occurs, now all the hormones start declining again: testosterone, estrogen, FSH, and LH. But we start to get a little increase in progesterone, because luteal phase is the time when progesterone starts to increase, because if an egg, for example, is fertilized, then this is when pregnancy is going to happen. But whether we want it or not, this is just like our natural biology. But our energy levels will start to decline during this time too. But women will also notice, like, they'll tend to be a little bit hotter, a little bit warmer. I know I definitely am warmer during my luteal phase, because progesterone actually creates a little heat in our body. So sometimes with the increase in progesterone, even though progesterone helps us to sleep, if we are too warm, this is important to like turn down the AC at night to help you to sleep. But yeah, it's so cool. Like once we learn about our hormones and the fluctuations, we can really use that to our advantage, and learn when can we be productive and push ourselves, and when should we pull back a little bit and take care of ourselves. Like during the menstrual phase, that is the best time for self-care, to nourish your body. If you need to take a nap, you know, or get a massage. That's the best time to do that. And I actually have a little a guide on how to use your cycle as a superpower in my bio. So if you click on the link in the bio, you can download that guide for free, print it out, put it on your fridge, so you always see it and you know what to do during those different phases of the month.
I love that. I think this is kind of like a perfect little place to like just talk about like ideas with that. And obviously the guide's going to give like way more in-depth information, but what she's kind of talking about, and I know she may have mentioned like a number of hormone names, and like you don't always need to be super familiar with them, but the beautiful flow that she talked about, this is like the symphony of our bodies, and it's really incredible. And then we'll dive a little bit into things, which is always an interesting thing, so we'll dive into that too. But the idea is like when you are basically 2 weeks past your period, it's a great time to do a project or be creative, or if you're like a female entrepreneur and you gotta like get some stuff done and have some meetings, that's a wonderful time to do that. And then as you start to kind of go down and all those hormones drop, which is what allows you to have your cycle. And a lot of people are also told that like if they're on birth control or whatever, they're like, oh, like you don't get a cycle, it's fine, it's part of it. And I remember that happened to me, and like my doctor told me that that was normal, and I was like, okay, cool. And it was a female doctor, and you know, you just learn to trust that. And then I had somebody point out to me who did functional medicine, where they're like, no, it's actually kind of like a detox process for your body, and it's important. It's like how your body releases some stuff. And also for people who want to just kind of set some more intentions, or like if you like to have a little bit of ceremony in your life, the period, the cycle, it can actually be this really beautiful connection to your own body, and a time where you can kind of release things and then set new intentions. And then I'd love if you could, in your book, you kind of talk about it. I'd love how, if you could speak to how, if you're not on birth control, or not on a hormonal birth control that's synthetically influencing your hormones, how many women's cycles sync to the lunar cycle. So you can actually kind of have like a new moon ceremony. So yeah, I'd love if you could talk about that.
Yeah. It's so cool. And a question just came in too. The question is like those who have hormonal cycle phases that are similar, let's see, my question, would those cycles phases be similar in someone who had a hysterectomy but kept their ovaries? And that is such a great question.
Absolutely.
Because it actually kind of ties into that as well. So it's interesting because if someone has had a hysterectomy and you still have your ovaries, you're actually still producing hormones a little bit. But it's also important to actually tune in with the moon cycle as well. So women who aren't having regular periods, who are have gone through menopause, women who've had surgeries to remove the hysterectomy, hysterectomy to either remove the uterus or uterus and the ovaries, they can actually follow the moon cycle. And it's so cool because when we actually look back into history, back in the day, women didn't have apps to track their cycle. I don't know how they did this, but they would follow the moon. And most of the time they were synced when it was time for the new moon. They would actually menstruate. They would get together in a tent and menstruate. And they actually use that time for self-care because the women are, back in the day were responsible for taking care of the family and, just taking care of everybody, just cooking and cleaning and all this stuff. But when it was time for them to menstruate, they'd get in the tent, they'd be together. They were actually taking care of themselves, nourishing themselves. And it's so important that we do that because it can really help just to recharge, re-energize our bodies and set us up for the rest of the month. Because when, like you and I, if we're high performance women, high performance achievers, and we push ourselves through a menstrual phase, we're setting ourselves up for burnout. And so tuning in with the lunar cycle can be really, really powerful. And when you're supporting your body and your health, you can actually notice that your energy levels might be lower during the new moon and higher with the full moon. Now, there are some women that are the opposite. Some women may actually have a low energy with the full moon and higher energy with the new moon. So it's not uncommon. Like if you feel like your energy is the opposite, that's okay, and that's normal for you because whether you're menstruating or not, women will typically follow either cycle. So you can totally still apply the same guide, how to use your cycle as a superpower. If you're not menstruating, having regular cycles, or you've had the hysterectomy, gone through menopause, you can still apply that by just following along with the lunar cycle, but tune into your energy to see whether your energy is the highest during the new moon or during the full moon, and then you can follow along because it's like basically a week by week guide of what to do, what not to do.
Love it. And before we dive into the whole like birth control thing, you just mentioned like menopause and how there's still a little bit of a connection there. So for women who are like perimenopausal or who have gone through menopause, can they still use their cycle or use the idea of their cycle as a superpower, or like how can they best work with their bodies?
Yes, same thing. I would have them just tune into the lunar cycle and just see how's their energy throughout. Is their energy the highest or lowest during the full moon or the new moon? And they can still apply that guide as well. And it's interesting because I'm actually releasing the audio version of my book this month on February 18th, and I actually added in chapter on menopause too because I realized
awesome.
The book is mainly focused on women who are currently cycling. I realized that it was important to touch upon this too because even though there are women that are already in menopause, but women who are starting to go through that can still develop estrogen dominance during that time. And the reason being is progesterone is the first hormone to decline. So when I talk about the three different patterns, pattern 2 and 3 is low progesterone with higher normal estrogen. When that happens as you go through menopause, progesterone declines. It can create that estrogen dominance effect. So a lot of women can develop a lot of these symptoms with estrogen dominance as well.
Beautiful. Thank you. I'm so excited that you added in a chapter about that. I'll have to re-listen to the book again.
Yeah.
I've already read it like a couple times. One of the things I like that she includes in her book that I feel like a lot of people also don't know about is the different metabolites of estrogen. And I guess since I'm mentioning it now, maybe I could just ask you a little bit about that, because a lot of women like don't even know about them, and they're not talked about. And there's many ways to test your hormones. You can test them with blood, which is kind of like a snapshot in time. But one of the things about blood is that, one, it doesn't address the metabolites, which is like how are your hormones being broken down and how does that affect your body. And it also does not show how your cells are using the hormones. So salivary testing is actually really helpful for seeing how your cells are actually utilizing it, whatever the levels in your blood are. And then urine is another way that you can look at the metabolites and stuff. And that's something she goes into in her book that I feel like gets skipped over a lot. So would you touch on that a little bit?
Yes, I love it, because when I was doing the testing and looking at my hormones and learning about estrogen metabolites, at first it was over my head, but then once I finally understood, I was like, this is actually really important.
It's cool.
And unfortunately, in conventional Western medicine, they don't look into it because they don't believe that it is necessary. It's like, okay, and it's interesting because there's a lot of studies out there looking at these estrogen metabolites and the importance of it, but it's not being tested. And the reason why it's important, because these urine metabolites is basically, like you mentioned, it's like when our body is using estrogen, it's getting broken down and it's getting excreted, we're looking at excretion through the urine. And these metabolites are coming from the liver, because when estrogen gets metabolized, it gets metabolized in the liver first. There's phase 1 and phase 2, which I talk about in the book. And then it goes through phase 3, which is our intestines. And that's how estrogen is eliminated, either through our intestines or via urine. But it's important to look at the metabolites in the liver because there's so many different things that can impact that. Like when I did the testing, I realized I needed to support phase 1 and phase 2, and there's different supplements and nutrients that are needed to support each phase. Now, not everyone needs support in phase 1 and phase 2. This is why it's important, one, to do the testing to see which phase needs support, because if you Google treatment of estrogen dominance, the most common supplement is DIM, which is diindolylmethane, which is an amazing supplement. I take it, I use it because I know I need it, because it's needed for phase 1. However, there are many women that take it and they get worsening of their symptoms. They get headaches and cramps and sometimes acne, and it can make them, or bloating, it can make them feel really worse because they didn't need support in phase 1. And so, yeah, a lot of practitioners can say, well, we can just check your hormones via blood work and that's sufficient. But then put someone on a protocol and it's not personalized and can actually end up making women feel worse.
Can I interject really quick?
Yeah.
So when she's talking about phase 1 and phase 2, so the liver has multiple phases of detoxing things. And one of the things that I think people forget is like, oh, I need a detox, I need a detox. And they'll push these detox pathways. However, if you actually need support in phase 2 and you push phase 1, it can actually kind of hurt your body, because it's like taking out the trash when the garbage men aren't coming. And then it just like builds up and builds up and builds up. And it's all this stuff sitting around in your body that it can't get rid of. So it can actually be bad to push phase 1 if you're not taking care of the later phases first. So you kind of have to go backwards in the phases.
Yeah. Exactly. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because I actually do a backwards approach where I actually do gut testing first to check phase 3, because you want to make sure you're eliminating every day. Because if we're going to push and help facilitate metabolism of estrogen through your liver, we want to make sure that you're getting rid of it in the intestines, because that can be a problem.
I also just want to say, because, you know, I think we think everybody knows these things, but it's not. Like, bowel movements just aren't something that people talk about, but they're really important. It's like the most important detox process of your body. And I'm just going to tell everyone right now, you should be having a bowel movement every single day. Not every other day, not once a week. Like, it should be every day. Just want to put that in there to make sure everybody knows this.
Yes, and I'm so glad you did, because as a physician assistant, when I went through school, I remember they were telling me when we were talking about the GI tract and bowel movements that, you know, whatever's normal for someone is normal. So even if they're going every other day or, you know, every 3 days, if that's normal for them, that's fine. But then I learned about functional medicine and metabolism and detoxification and optimal gut health. I learned that no, people should be going at least once a day.
Minimum.
2 or 3 times. Yeah, minimum. 2 to 3 times, you know, is the max. If you go more than that, if you're like 4 or 5 times, that might be a little bit too much. Things are moving too quickly.
When we're thinking about IBS, things like that.
Exactly. And that's because we want to make sure we're getting rid of inactive hormones, a lot of toxins in our body, because if not, it's just being
And that goes for if you're taking medications too. So people forget that, like, if you're not having that bowel movement, whatever you're putting into your body stays there. And so you might be like having this weird buildup of medications or whatever, hormones, whatever, if you're not having that movement. So thank you. Thanks for letting me interject there.
absolutely. And it's like, you're not only what you eat, you're also what you digest, absorb, and can't eliminate either. And I mentioned that in the book because it's like, that's why it's so important. We got to support gut health first. Then we can look at the liver, see what's happening, look at the phase 1 and phase 2, where support is needed. Because phase 1, cruciferous vegetables are really important. And that's also something too, like food, the power of food can really help support our hormones and the metabolization of estrogen as well. So loading up on those cruciferous vegetables is really going to help support phase 1. Leafy greens, and like kale and spinach and cabbage.
Hard.
Yeah, chard. All those leafy greens are going to really support phase 2 because it's going to contain those B vitamins, and foods that are high in magnesium like pumpkin seeds and dark chocolate. Yes, women can have dark chocolate, especially right before the menstrual phase and even during the period. Just make sure it's a good source of chocolate.
And dark chocolate, that's going to be above like 70% dark chocolate. And personally, I prefer like a dairy-free one because dairy can also really affect your hormones, which that's kind of the next thing I want to jump into is a little bit about foods. I'm like thinking of a good order to go into here. So I want to talk about, the dark chocolate, one of the brands I like is Hu, HU. It's basically like short for human, and it's like a brown and black package, usually at natural stores, but they're like vegan, void of all the crappy stuff. And so they're one that I like. But I think that kind of wrapped up what we were talking about there. So before we dive into birth control, because that's going to basically be like the disruptor of everything, right? So I want to talk about like all the things that happen in our body, and then we'll talk about what that effect is. So can you speak a little bit to why it's important to like have a healthy source, as you just stated, and then just kind of like how, I know in your book you talk about like insulin levels and histamine and how these can affect hormones. I'd love if you could chat about that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many things that can contribute and cause estrogen dominance, and definitely poor gut health is probably one of the main ones. But also birth control too. A lot of women don't realize. And when I look back along my life, I realized, I had gut issues. I had consumed a lot of meat and dairy that were just probably high in antibiotics, high in hormones. And when you're taking in hormones from the outside and food, that's just adding to the hormones, and your body thinks there's more hormones than there really is. And that's probably what contributed to my acne. And plus these foods are also inflammatory, like dairy is very inflammatory, gluten. And so removing these things can really help heal the gut, but also help support our hormones. But birth control too, a lot of women don't realize. And unfortunately, as a physician assistant, I was never taught about long-term effects, except, if you're smoking, you definitely want to avoid it because of increased risk of clots, or strokes. But they didn't talk about that birth control affects your gut. It causes something called leaky gut, and there's even studies that prove it and show that there's a link between the development of birth control and Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, and I talk about that in the book as well. It also impacts your liver's ability to produce bilirubin, which is needed to create bile, and bile helps to bind inactive estrogen as it's metabolized through the liver to bind it and go to your intestines for elimination. So if that process is being impacted, we're not producing enough bilirubin, we're not having enough bile to bind that inactive estrogen, which was like huge. And of course, it's interesting, it impacts the gallbladder. And so I've had clients come to me with gallbladder issues, and they're taking birth control, and they're like, oh, I talked to my doctor about it, but they said, oh no, birth control doesn't cause gallbladder issues. But there's so many studies out there showing that there is a link. Birth control does contribute to gallbladder problems. And I'm like, let's get you off the birth. And of course, they also had imbalanced estrogen because of that impact. So that's another thing that a lot of women aren't aware. And it increases something called sex hormone binding globulin, which happened to me because when this protein's increase, what it does, it binds up a lot of our hormones like testosterone. So when I came off, I had like really low levels of testosterone. And when women have low levels of testosterone, they're losing their hair, they have libido, and that was definitely impacting me. So I had to do a lot of work to help to lower that sex hormone binding globulin. There are certain supplements that can help do that. but also just like really helping to support my hormones. So there's so many things that women aren't aware of, but I talk about all those things, the impact of birth control and how it contributes to estrogen dominance. Also histamines, that was another thing that was like a game changer because
Yeah, let's dive into that one.
yeah, like I love this topic because when I was helping a lot of my female clients balance their hormones, a lot of them were getting better, but then there was a percentage that weren't getting better, even though we were working on the gut, optimize their nutrients, manage the stress. They weren't getting better. And I'm like, what's the missing key? And I realized it was histamines. So I started checking histamine level on these women, and their histamines were really, really high. So once I discovered this, I pulled out histamine foods, put them on natural supplements to help break down histamines in their body. And it was like a 360-degree change. It was like from one day to the next, they were completely better. PMS symptoms were gone. Anxiety, mood swings were gone. Gut issues were gone, because there is a link between estrogen and histamine. And I talk about this in the book as well, because estrogen and the histamine attach to the same receptor H1. And so when there's a lot of excess imbalanced estrogen, it can actually cause more histamines to be released, and then more histamines can also flare up estrogen as well. So it almost becomes this vicious cycle. And so once we were working to balance and support estrogen metabolism, I also had to make sure we lower that histamine response in the body, because at the end of the day, it's also like it's part of your immune system. So we had to lower the histamine response, and it made the rest of those clients so much better. So it's something that a lot of people aren't aware of too. Like there are a lot of people out there that have issues with histamines. And if you look up the symptoms of histamine intolerance, it's like a laundry list. But if you are doing a lot of the work and you realize you're not getting better, that could be the missing key that could really make a difference. So.
Absolutely. And for anyone who's not like super familiar with histamine symptoms, think about when you're having like a mild allergic reaction. So this can be like all of a sudden your body feels kind of hot, or you might feel itchy, especially on like your palms and the soles of your feet, or in your detox centers, armpits, anything like that. It can show up as hives or welts when it's like a little bit worse. It can be exercise induced. So any of those things can tell you that you might have a little bit higher histamine level in the body, which then can tell you might have a little higher estrogen level in the body. And then she talked about how you can have like low testosterone as a result of having your hormones synthetically manipulated. And then one of the other things that can happen, especially if your detox pathways aren't working, you're getting this estrogen buildup, and this can be influenced by genetics too, because some people like might have more enzymes, some people might have less. You can actually have an estrogen buildup that then gets turned into testosterone because they go back and forth, and then you can end up with really high testosterone levels. And in women, this can look like acne in weird places, or maybe hirsutism, which is like getting some dark hairs on the chin or something like that. And so, you know, if you've had acne your whole life, that's like not really normal, and it might mean that you have high testosterone, which might mean that you weirdly have high estrogen. So these are all things that you can explore with a functional medicine provider like Kate or myself. So love it. Thank you. So you talked about histamines. I think one of the other important things to talk about is I want to kind of touch back a little bit on food that you talked about. And for those who don't know what crucifers are, it's like Brussels sprouts, asparagus, kale, cabbage, all those kind of like tough veggies, things like that, bok choy, that kind of stuff. So any of those that you can get into your diet is great. So can you talk a little bit about the relationship between hormones and insulin? And you were talking about like fibrocystic breasts and things like that, but people can also have cysts in their uterus. And I cannot tell you the number of patients I have who have like literally had the same surgery that a C-section is to go in and remove a cyst, which it's like, yes, cysts can be really uncomfortable. They can also affect your ability to get pregnant, all this stuff. But it's like, instead of having a surgery to go in and remove your cyst and then be put on a bunch of fake hormones in order to make you fertile, let's talk about ways that you can just get those things to balance naturally with food.
Yeah, absolutely.
And where you get your food matters because of the chemicals that are in our food now from how they're processed and how our agriculture and our livestock is raised.
Yeah, it's so important. And I'm like, it's crazy. To answer your question about the insulin, I do believe there's a link between insulin resistance and estrogen dominance. Unfortunately, there's not any studies that say yes, there's a cause. But if you think about it, when women develop insulin resistance, it's usually because there's just like high glucose levels in the body, and eventually and the pancreas is constantly producing a lot of insulin to keep up and help like lower that glucose. But over time, it's like the adrenals. The pancreas gets kind of tired if it's trying to pump out a lot of insulin. And so eventually over time, the cells stop responding to insulin. And so women will have these higher glucose levels. And when there's higher glucose levels, that creates a lot of inflammation in the body. A lot of women will start to develop weight gain. And when they start gaining weight, now actually our fat cells naturally produce estrogen. But when we start gaining a lot more weight, now we're producing even more estrogen in the body. And then that is how that contributes to estrogen dominance. Plus, with insulin resistance, we've also seen a lot of women, especially like with PCOS, develop cysts on their ovaries because of higher androgen levels. So there's a link there. And it's interesting because when I actually do the testing in women with PCOS, they also have imbalanced excess estrogen as well. So it's not only the androgens we have to look at, we have to make sure the glucose levels are controlled to make sure insulin is more sensitive, not resistant, to help women have optimal healthy weight. So that way we are decreasing this. But yeah, also leading into the food, I talk about, sugar. Sugar is probably the biggest culprit. I know it creates inflammation in our body, causes us to gain.
It's in everything. Like hidden sugar is crazy.
It is. And when I learned about sugar, like women should only have 24 grams, which is 4 teaspoons of sugar per day. And when I learned this statistic, even the American Heart Association recommends this. And so I started looking at, I used to have eat 100-calorie packs and all these granola bars. I used to eat cereal that had added sugar in it and a yogurt. And when I started adding up, all these things that looked like they were healthy, they had added sugar in it. And I was like, whoa, I was eating way too much sugar per day. So then I switched to oatmeal. I don't add any sugar, no honey, nothing to it. Like I only get natural sugar from fruit in my oatmeal, and adding fat to it. And that was another thing, because when I was eating a lot more sugar, I had more cravings. And that's because sugar gets burned very quickly. So we eat the sugar, we get a spike in our glucose, and it gets burned very quickly, and then we get a crash. So I was hungry every 2 hours. Once I started adding more fats into my food, because we also need healthy fats to support and produce our hormones, I stopped having the sugar cravings. I was able to maintain a healthier weight, and I had more energy too, which is crazy. So yeah, looking at how much sugar are you eating in a day, because that high sugar is going to increase that glucose response, increase insulin sensitivity, or not sensitivity, increase insulin resistance, and can contribute to weight gain and then inflammation in the body, which can then also start impacting our hormones. But also talking about the chemicals in foods, like a lot of pesticides, antibiotics, and hormones. So I talk about meat and dairy, especially back in the day, used to contain a lot of antibiotics and hormones. Thankfully, there's a lot of companies out there that are making sure, if you do consume meat, that it's clean, no antibiotics and hormones, which is awesome. And also foods, I always recommend sticking to as much organic as possible. Granted, I do understand sometimes buying everything organic can definitely add up. So thankfully, the Environmental Working Group created the Dirty Dozen and Clean 15 list, where if you just stick to the Dirty Dozen, those are the top foods, the 12 top foods that are the highest amount of pesticides. Because I also understand, because I've had this conversation with my parents. They're like, well, organic is not 100% organic. I'm like, I get that. But for me, I'd rather reduce the toxic burden on my body as much as possible. So if anything, at least stick to those top 12 foods, get those organic as much as you can. And also just consuming, those cruciferous vegetables, lots of fiber, because fiber is going to help support those healthy bowel movements. A lot of
pulls out the estrogen.
Exactly, helps to pull out that estrogen, and a lot of healthy fats like avocados, wild-caught salmon, nuts and seeds, olives. So really increasing a lot of healthy fats to support the production of the hormones. And then foods with probiotics, so anything that's fermented like sauerkraut and kimchi. I recommend non-dairy yogurt, so coconut yogurt, but be careful, because there's a lot of brands that have a lot of added sugar. My favorite brand is Cocoa, because it's made of pure coconut milk, and they'll add raspberry puree or something to make it flavored.
And I just want to throw in, so if you're shopping and you see yogurts and stuff that say like low fat, or you get like low fat skim milk, or basically low fat just means extra sugar.
Added sugar, exactly.
Yeah.
It's
So
so
just
crazy.
don't get that. We want fat. Fat's good. It's
Yeah,
not the bad guy.
exactly. Fats are good, and it's crazy because I used to be scared of fat, because we were just like taught and ingrained like
We were brainwashed.
back in the day, yeah, fat was bad. It increases cardiovascular disease and diabetes and all that. But I know it's the bad fat that creates inflammation in our body. But if we stick to healthy fats, the omega 3s, and make sure there's a healthy balance between omega 3 and omega 6, we actually need a lot of fat and actually keeps our blood sugar stable. So there's so many benefits to that. And there was one other thing I was going to mention, but it's in my brain. But yeah,
No
yeah,
worries.
definitely focus on, like you said, getting the full fat, and don't be afraid of it, because it's actually our bodies need that, and you'll feel a huge difference as well.
Beautifully said. Thank you. Okay, so we were talking about that, and then we were talking a bit about insulin. And so let's talk a little bit. Okay, so I want to first point out, so when she's talking about organic and stuff, so I think one of the most difficult things is reading labels. So if you're at the store and you're looking for like a meat that we would approve of, basically when it comes to fish, we want to get wild caught. Farmed fish is probably one of the more unhealthy things you can eat, because they pump them full of antibiotics and hormones and stuff that fish are not supposed to eat. So wild caught is preferred. If you can find one that says sustainable, that's ideal, because obviously we also have environmental issues with our oceans and stuff. So it's about the balance, right? And I think it becomes really overwhelming for people, because it's like there's so many variables to control for when it comes to trying to eat healthy, and nutrition's really confusing. So it's like all we can do is our best. Like, it's impossible to avoid toxins at this point in our environment. Humans have just kind of toxified it. So the best we can do is just the best we can do. So looking for wild caught when it's seafood. And ones that tend to be lower in like heavy metals and things like that, it's gonna be like salmon. Or you had an acronym for this. What was the acronym?
Yes, the acronym is SMASH, which is salmon, mackerel, anchovies, sardines, and herring or halibut. So yeah,
Awesome.
those definitely, if you can't remember, just think SMASH.
Perfect. And then when it comes to red meats, things like that, I prefer basically game meat. So like venison, bison, lamb, things like that over beef, just because the way our cows have been raised, the proteins are a bit more inflammatory these days. You can still do beef, but just look for grass-fed and pasture-raised. And when it comes to eggs, sorry, cage-free does not mean anything. That's kind of, yeah, and natural also doesn't mean anything. So we're really looking for organic, grass-fed, pasture-raised. Those are going to be the three key words you can look for. And what?
And grass finished, because sometimes grass fed
doesn't always mean that.
Yeah, they could be finished off with grains. So that was another thing too, learning. I mean, I don't eat red meat just because I'm type A plus blood type, A positive. So, yeah, I don't really do well with meat anyway. But yeah, for those who can tolerate meat and feel really good eating meat, yeah, you want to make sure you do the research and get the best quality. And thankfully, there's companies out there like Butcher Box, which actually provides the best quality meat out there. Also, Vital Choice. So there's question mussels and clams. Vital Choice is great for seafood and shellfish, because they make sure that it's good quality, low heavy metals. So finding companies like that, that you're getting good quality is going to be key.
Thank you. Okay, Vital Choice, Butcher Box, perfect. All right, so we kind of talked about those. And one of the other things I'm always an advocate for is like support your local farmers. So it's really easy to go like somewhere nearby and find some farmer that will like sell you nice, healthy meat from their farm. And I love supporting small businesses. I think it's what is really, I think it's a hugely important thing in our world right now as we deal with like massive corporate takeovers. So please go support your local farmers and buy local. And that's a really easy way to get good, clean stuff. and you know where it's coming from, and that's really nice. And it just connects you with your food in a different way, because I feel like sometimes we're so removed from the process of our foods and stuff that we forget, and it creates a different connection in your body when you're consuming the energy of something that was living, whether it's a plant or an animal. And if you can kind of know where it comes from, you have this different appreciation for it. And the emotional state that you eat your food in actually affects how you metabolize it. So if you're like eating on the go and you're not really thinking about it, your mind's totally elsewhere, you're literally gonna break down your food differently than if you're mindful of it and have a connection with it. So just a thought there for you.
Oh, I love that. Actually, I forgot what it's called, but I remember seeing pictures of meat and plants, and then plants that are live versus plants that are like cooked, and just seeing like the energy.
Carillion photography.
Yes, it is so interesting because, yeah, when meat is killed, like there really isn't that much energy that's being produced. Yes, you're getting some nutrients from that, but the key is to eat as many plant foods as possible, because plants contain energy. They contain a lot of nutrients, and like you meant, it's information for our cells. And so, you know, I recommend like a primary whole food plant-based diet, whether you still consume meat or not. The choice is up to you. But you know, if anything, if you do consume meat, I recommend like checking out Dr. Hyman. He wrote, he's big on what's called the Pegan diet, where it's basically fill your plate with lots of you know, plant foods, and meat should be a condiment. Like it should be a very small portion on your plate, but what we should be eating is just mostly plant foods, just because they contain so many nutrients and energy. And I know when I switched to mostly a whole food plant-based diet, my energy went up, and I was like, wow, I didn't realize I could feel this good, because there's just so much energy in them. But yeah, seeing that, I was like, wow, this is amazing. And even if plants are cooked a little bit, they still have more energy being emitted than the animal meat, which I thought was really fascinating.
It's so fascinating. So I want to touch on a couple last few topics before we wrap up. So one of them, I think nutrition and like how to eat is one of the most confusing things for people right now. And one of the reasons it's confusing is because our bodies are so unique and different, which is where, like, this is why I fell in love with functional medicine, is because it's customized, and it's customized to figure out what your body does well with. So like Kate mentioned that she has you said blood type A, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So yes. And so that deals, there's a whole theory about like how your blood type can affect the way that you eat, or your blood type basically affects the way that you metabolize food. And so certain foods can be better for different blood types. Now myself, I'm a blood type O, and I tried going vegan. My body hated it. So like I need some animal protein. It's important. And it can vary like that. And then one of the things I also work a lot with people on is food sensitivities. And sensitivity is different than an allergy. And so if you're sensitive to certain types of foods and you're consuming those, you may not have immediate reactions. It can often be delayed. And then you can start to wonder like why you have brain fog, or why you get itchy, or why you don't sleep well, or why you're grumpy, or whatever. And this can literally all be tied to food sensitivities. So like I'll run a little blood test on people to figure out like, hey, what foods is your immune system accidentally producing a response to, which usually comes and stems from leaky gut. And for people who aren't super familiar with leaky gut, it's like your gut lining is supposed to be made of cells that have tight junctions, and they're adhered like this. Over time, with stress and eating pesticides and various things, they start to get a little bit porous like this. And then food particles can leak through and get into areas that they're not supposed to be there. And the body's like, whoa, like you're not supposed to be here, attack that thing. And all of a sudden you're sensitive to bananas, and like you never had an issue with bananas before. And this is why food sensitivities can fluctuate. So you can have them for a little while, and then they can go away, and then you can be sensitive to something else. And this is where gut healing comes in. So at a certain time in your life, it may be beneficial for you to have more vegetables and less whole grains. And then as your gut heals, you can actually bring in more whole grains, and it helps to feed your biome in different ways. So rotating foods, I think, is really important for people, and just learning how to get in touch with your body. And that's why I love doing these things, is because it teaches you what to look out for. And like, if you're having like bags under your eyes, or you're waking up puffy, you were sensitive to something in the last 24 to 72 hours. And so you can kind of start to track your food and be like, hey, what made me puffy? And start to look at that. So that could be like a whole other hour on its own. So I'll jump.
I'm glad you brought that up, because before I healed my gut, I couldn't eat cruciferous. I couldn't eat broccoli and cauliflower. I got so bloated and gassy with that. And of course, we need that to help support estrogen metabolism, and even beans, and also tomatoes. I'm super, super sensitive to tomatoes. So once I finally healed my gut, I was able to bring these foods back in, and now no more bloating, no more gas. I can digest them and eat them. But the only thing is, I still can't eat tomatoes to this day. So that is a true sensitivity. The others I was sensitive to, because there was a lot going on in the gut. So this is why it's important, when we figure out, because I can tell you all the foods to eat, but you might be reacting to those foods. So it's important to heal the gut, look at what you're sensitive to in the moment. Once the gut is healed, you can bring those foods back in and see what you're still reacting to or not. And I always tell my clients, I'm like, your body's the best test. And when we can remove these foods for a period of time and bring them back in, now we really see what you're really, truly reacting to. Because sometimes you might be reacting and not even realizing, because your body's been tolerating it for so long. But it's not until you pull them out, allow the body to heal, now your body can tell you what it likes and what it doesn't like. And that's the beauty of functional medicine, being able to discover that and really help personalize everything.
Yep. Oh, I love it. I love it. So I had like a couple other things I thought would be great to address. And one of them, this could be, again, like a whole other, actually, Kylene, another friend of ours, and I did a whole series on how stress affects your body, including the whole pathways and how it affects your hormones. And so that could be like a whole hour thing. So I want to briefly touch on that, and how, like, if you have a high level of stress going on in your life, the molecules that make your stress hormones are the same building blocks your body needs to make your sex hormones. And so we get this thing called cortisol steal, where your cortisol, your stress hormone, which we need, it's important, but if it's like there all the time because you're in a stressful home environment, stressful work environment, or you're just perceiving a lot of stress in your life, or you're dealing with a 2-year-long pandemic kind of thing, it can start to literally steal your sex hormones. And then you can have the symptoms of low sex hormones, like low libido, all this kind of stuff, and low thyroid. So stuff like that. So that's just like a little touch on there. If you want to learn a little bit more about those pathways, definitely get Kate's book. She has a whole chapter about it. And then also there's that live I did the other week with Kylene, and we kind of dive into it there. But the last main thing I want to address is birth control. And I also kind of want to tell people like what it can look like to get caught in this cycle, and how you can get here over a period of years. So I'm just going to share a little bit about my own, and then I'm going to let Kate go nuts on this. So when I was like 16 or whatever, like you start to get your cycle as a female, and then it's like a little bit off, which is normal because your body has to learn how to work with it. So it's normal for your cycle to be a little bit off when it starts and like be heavy or whatever. But these days, it's like if you have a heavy cycle and you're slightly moody as a teenager, you're just sent to the doctor, where they automatically put you on synthetic hormones, which then basically messes up your hormones for a really long time and messes up your gut. So now you've literally stimulated leaky gut in a teenager early in their life, which leads to, it's basically like the foundation of most diseases. And so you're setting that teenager up for a life of dealing with inflammatory issues. And then when you start to get moody because you've now been put on synthetic hormones, the next protocol is to put them on antidepressants, which further gives you leaky gut and further messes up all of your other body systems. So this is kind of how it starts, and no one really talks about this. And not to say that birth control isn't like this really helpful thing that helped women be able to step out of like only being homemakers and step into being independent people in society and start to have a little bit more control in their bodies. But there are other ways that you can also kind of naturally monitor your cycle and have natural birth control, which I'll let Kate touch on the whole temperature thing. But it's like you start with this getting put on synthetic hormones, then getting put on an antidepressant, then starting to have inflammatory reactions, then starting to have weird anxiety stuff. And it just like builds and builds and builds. And you're on these hormones for years and nobody talks to you about this stuff. No. So this is why I love doing this, is to just educate people about their bodies so that you can make informed decisions for whatever is right for you, because you should always have that choice. So Kate, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, of course. And I'm glad you said that, because at the end of the day, yeah, it should be an informed choice. You should understand like what are the long-term impacts. And I believe like women should have the opportunity to do everything that they can to balance the hormones naturally first. And if you learn about your cycle, learn how to track, you can actually learn how to, do what's called the fertility awareness method, and which is actually what I'm doing now, because even though I went off birth control almost 3 years ago, I'm not ready for pregnancy yet. I'm not ready to start our family, because I'm like, thankfully we still have time, and I'm just focusing all my energy on the business. And so I learned about tracking my cycle in the fertility awareness method, where technically women only have 24 hours that they are fertile. Men are fertile every single day of their life. Once they go through puberty, they're pretty much fertile every day. But women, we only have a 24-hour window that we are fertile. However, because sperm can live in the body for up to 5 days, if you understand, how the cycle works, and ovulation is when you are the most fertile. And I dive into this a little bit. If you learn how to track your cycle, check your cervical mucus, you can learn to predict when you are the most fertile. And when when your ovulation day is, I always recommend the first like 5 days leading up to ovulation, in the day or two, that's your fertile window. So even though we have 24 hours, it still can happen before and a couple days after ovulation, because the sperm can live in the body a little bit longer. So when you are tracking and checking your cervical mucus and learning about your fertility, if you don't want to get pregnant, I always say either abstain, use condoms, use protection, or just don't have vaginal intercourse during that time, and you won't get pregnant. And it's really that simple, but it requires you to be responsible and to constantly track. But once after the first few cycles, once you understand how your body works when you're fertile, it becomes so easy. And it's crazy because I feel like back in the day, birth control, like as you mentioned, was created to help empower women, to help them step out and be, get into the workforce, to be able to provide for their families, to become independent. But in a way, I felt like it did take our power away, because what it does, it suppresses all our hormones, and it affects, we need our hormones to be able to tune into that energy, because as I mentioned, we can use it as a cycle, use our cycle as a superpower, but when our hormones are suppressed, it's a lot harder to do that. And we're just kind of like not understanding the long-term effects. And unfortunately, when women are taking it for a long period of time, when they come off, I've seen family and friends and coworkers, when they come off birth control ready to get pregnant, they ended up miscarrying. And that's like, there's something wrong there. Like something's happening with our hormones. And I think it's like actually more empowering if we learn about our cycle, learn about our hormones, start tracking it and taking control of our own fertility. I think that's more empowering than using a pill. But at the end of the day, I'm not here to say I'm for it or against it. Definitely do everything that you can, educate yourself about it, the pros, the cons, learn about it, learn about long-term effects. I always recommend do everything you can to support your hormones naturally. If nothing works and birth control is the last resort, then obviously that's the last resort. But still, I would say do everything that you can before you get to that point. And at the end of the day, just have that conversation, with your provider, and even like a functional medicine practitioner who has a better understanding as well.
Thank you. That was perfectly said. So I love this, right? Because I'm all about teaching people about their bodies and allowing them to understand, because it's, if you're not in this field, it's just like not something that you learn about on average. Like, you know, an accountant's going to know a lot more about taxes than myself, and I will know more about hormones than your accountant. So it's like, this is why we tap into experts. So we covered a lot of stuff today. We talked about how your hormones fluctuate and like what your cycle actually looks like. We talked about how foods can, and also like the symptoms of estrogen dominance. We talked about the metabolites and the metabolites of your hormones and how that can affect your body, and how to work with food to aid that and help your body process that. We talked about toxins in food and like different labels that you can look for to start to kind of just easily take that out of your diet, because the best thing that we can do for ourselves in this world is just take as much of the burden off our bodies as we can. We can't be perfect, but this is how we start to make things a little bit easier on our bodies. We talked about how insulin and histamine can start to affect everything. We talked about how stress can affect your hormones, how important foods are, and then lastly, kind of how birth control can affect things, and how you can start to naturally work with your body if that's, you know, if you want options. Like, know that there are options. So if you want to learn more about this stuff, I highly recommend getting Kate's book. It's I think it's really well written and it's easy to read. And especially if you're not familiar with this stuff, she did a really good job of just breaking things down in easy portions. So if people want to learn more about your book and more about your work, and like when the audiobook comes out, where can they do that? Where would you direct them?
Yeah, absolutely. So definitely follow me on on Instagram at Vazquez_PA. If you have any questions, just send me a DM. You know, I'm open. I love helping women in any way that I can. So if you have any questions, send them my way. Send me a DM. You can also find me online at yourradianthealth.com. And as far as the book, yeah, I am releasing the audio version February 18th. But if you can't wait until then, the paperback, hardcover, and Kindle version are available on Amazon already, so you can head to Amazon. But if you want to wait for the Audible, it will be released February 18th. And there's so much information. I dive into everything, and I'm so glad that you said it was easy for you, because that was my goal. Because I'm a huge science nerd and geek, and I wanted to I wanted to bring it down to a level that's easy, understandable, and digestible, to really help educate, inspire, and empower women to learn about their bodies, their hormones, and to take their health back in their control. So definitely go check it out. And I'm so excited to release the Audible version, because I know that's been a big request lately, especially for women that are on the go, which is perfect, because then you can listen to it when you're running errands, when you're driving, working out, whatever that you're doing on the go. This will be an amazing option for you.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you so much, Kate. I love our chats, and it was so nice to see you. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out to myself or to Kate, and we're always here for you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. I had so much fun and enjoyed this conversation. Great questions, and I'm looking forward to the next one.
Okay, sounds good. Have a good day.
Bye.